if you recall, last episode was a very important one because we laid out the route that MH370 could have gone north and would have evaded all of the radar that probably the average person, when they hear about this, says, no way. That's like, their eye is in the sky, but we showed why there isn't. And today we're going to get a little bit deeper into the 7th, 12th phenomenon here that makes this story so amazingly insane.
This is a tale of twists and turns, as we promised at the beginning. The more you look at it, the crazier it gets. There's always twists and turns. There's always surprises. And another big one. Another big one drops today. So where we left it last episode was the plane had flown over India, Nepal, the Himalayan ridge, over some countries that formerly belonged to the Soviet Union. And that's sort of where we pick up the tale today.
Yeah, so I want to kind of bring you back in time to 2014. Right. You're sitting in the green room at CNN, and on a computer screen, they start listing the names of the passengers on the manifest. And a couple stood out to you. One was a passenger from Russia. His name was Nikolai Brodsky. Mm-hmm. And then there were 2 Ukrainians on the plane, Sergei Denika. My Ukrainian's kind of so-so. Okay.
Yeah.
Sergei and Oleg Chustrak. I really got a bone up on my Ukrainian, but nonetheless, those hit you like a bolt of lightning, right? So tell me what crossed your mind.
Yes. So the Malaysians from the beginning had been kind of very parsimonious in doling out the information, and so we're always waiting to get the new dribs and drabs of information, and they finally released the passenger manifest, who was on this plane. And these 3 names leaped out to me. I had already been wondering, who on board this plane might have taken it. And these 3 Russian names. Now, I don't know how many Russians or Ukrainians typically travel on a red-eye flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. I would think probably not that many.
I wouldn't think so.
And who are these guys? And so I wondered, who were they? Why were they on the plane? And I spent a lot of time looking into these guys. I even flew to Ukraine to do some research.
So you knew about Brodsky, right? So like this guy, there is some information out there. The Russian media had contacted his family. They interviewed him.
What we knew about Nikolai Brodsky was that he had a wife. He had a son from a previous marriage. And he had this timber business, and he was an active scuba diver. He used to dive under the ice of Lake Baikal in the winter. So kind of a tough guy, and so he seemed like a guy that was not sort of living in the shadows or anything. Like it seemed like he was who he seemed to be.
He had like a public persona.
He had a public persona.
He was on a scuba diving trip to Bali, and he was coming back early. Right. Because either he promised his wife that he would go to dinner with her on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, or he had to go on a business trip to Mongolia.
Yeah, there were kind of conflicting accounts about that. International Women's Day is something which I'd never heard of before MH370. Since then, it's become more of a known thing. It was sort of a socialist, like international communist.
I've definitely heard of it, but I don't know if I would cut my work trip short on that one. It's not Valentine's Day, but
I thought it was weird, but then people who are from Ukraine and from Russia told me that no, it's actually a big deal. It's kind of like it's a little bit like Valentine's Day. It's like it's in honor of women in general. So it's not romantic.
Okay. So we should point out that this episode we're just going to we're going to touch on some of this stuff because there's a hell of a lot more detail, but I did want to ask you where Brodsky was sitting on the plane.
Okay. So Brodsky was sitting in the front of the plane, like in the first class cabin. I don't think it was styled as first class. It was business class. Okay. But it was the rich people's part of the plane, the nice part of the plane. So he was, but that becomes interesting later.
He was but feet away from that piece of carpet with the stairs that takes you down.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
All right.
right.
So now the other two guys that raised your attention, these two Ukrainians,
Right.
less is known about these guys. Their relatives didn't want to talk to the media. And what we do know is that they had an online furniture company called Nika Mibel. You know, I took a semester of high school Russian, but apparently did not. I didn't pick very much up. I can read a little Cyrillic, but obviously I'm not doing a great job on this. But we do know that Mebel is a Russian word for furniture, and they were joint owners of this furniture factory in Odessa. It was kind of new, right? Like they weren't selling any furniture yet.
There was no store. They supposedly had a factory, but I've never been able to determine where the supposed factory was. They had started this online store the previous year. Like if you went back to Internet Archives, sort of in the late 2013, you start to see this store. And before that, it raised kind of the question to me, like, okay, these guys had this company, but where were they making the furniture? How are they selling the furniture? And again, this is something we'll get into more detail later, but the fact that their relatives didn't want to talk about it, they had this sort of shady looking online store. And they were kind of these like lunky, big lunky guys.
I've seen the security footage, and it's in the Netflix documentary. And I mean, if you had to pick out people who look like special agents or operatives, it would probably be these guys.
This sort of I think I described at one point as like the kind of guys that Liam Neeson would get into like a fist fight on an airplane with.
Yeah, definitely.
Florence Tishagi, who was also in the Netflix documentary, she's the French lady who thinks that the Americans shot it down.
Right.
But she saw the security cam footage way before I did, and she described these guys as looking like if anyone on this plane were air pirates, as she called it in French. I think that just means hijacker, but if anyone was air pirates, it was these guys.
Which, I mean, obviously it's not a fair
which is not probative
accusation to level on anyone, but they weren't little puny dudes. They were big tough guys on a plane.
So,
does the fact that the timber company and the furniture company, is there any connection there, or is that just has anyone thought about that?
Because you need timber to make furniture.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
I mean, let's chew over that like a little bit more later. But I will say that these guys both got involved in business in the early 90s when the Soviet Union had collapsed. Everything was up for grabs. Things like timber concessions were that had been owned by the state were now kind of seized by these. A lot of them are like kind of organized crime people.
Okay. All right. So now we're into July 2014, and
but I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay.
Although it's a testament to the quality of our audio connection that I can interrupt you.
Yeah, it's a good sign.
But I wanted to say that last week we talked about how the plane might have actually wound up in Kazakhstan. And then, so that made me really interested in the Russians on board the plane. And so I actually, by early July, had hired investigators in both Russia and Ukraine to sort of see what was going on with possibly tracking down the activities of these people who were on the plane.
Can you tell me how that
Ukraine,
worked?
I was thinking about Russia.
Yeah, like just as an aside, like how do you do that?
How do you do what?
How do you hire investigators in Ukraine and Russia to dig up the dirt? Without getting them in trouble. Like, how'd you do that?
I didn't know how to do it. I've since done it like a whole bunch of times, but my first way I did it was to call up my buddy at the New York Times, who's a muckety muck, and I said, "Can you put me in touch with an investigator in Russia?" And he put me in touch with a really excellent freelancer who did amazing work.
Did you get some stuff out of it? I mean, did you learn?
I got a lot out of it, which I'll be sharing later.
All right, so we'll save that for later. Okay, so we're in mid-July, July 17th, and you've already got a little bit of a suspicion that maybe Russia has something to do with this. Your phone rings, and it's a producer from CNN asking if you could go on the air to talk about Malaysia Airlines 777 that had just gone down over Ukraine, and of course, you think, what?
I was like, you mean the Malaysian Airlines 777 that went down, that went missing over the South China Sea? She's like,
Right.
no, Ukraine. I'm like, what? This is ridiculous. I mean, I had suspected a connection between Malaysia, MH370 and Russia and Ukraine, because I'd already been thinking that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the reason why they, took it to distract attention. And now you're saying that that one got shot down in Ukraine? I'm like, it's like they're rubbing our face in it. And I had sort of thought, weirdly, I was like, a lot of people at the time were like, let's solve the mystery of MH370, right? A lot of people, the whole independent group that I think I've talked about a little bit, all of these smart people were trying to solve this mystery so they could say, I'm the person that solved the mystery of MH370, right?
Yeah.
It's not really what a journalist is supposed to be thinking like, but it's hard not to think like that.
Right.
When you've got like the world's greatest mystery that everyone in the world is thinking and talking about 24/7, right? And so I'm like, well, this is it. I mean, it's obvious what happened now. I mean, the connection between Russia, Ukraine, Malaysian Airlines 777s. I mean, it's just. I mean, that was like one of my first thoughts. One of my other early thoughts, like immediate thoughts, was, oh my God, what have I done? I've hired a person in Russia to poke around, and now they've just murdered 295 more people in cold blood. So I was like I have blood on my hands because if this researcher gets arrested and thrown in jail, I was thinking about, was it the Killing Fields where the New York Times photographer gets imprisoned because of the New York Times reporter?
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure, but someone reassured you that probably was not the case, I think, right?
Well, the world did not immediately conclude that, oh yeah, obviously there was a connection.
Yeah, Jeff Wise did it.
Well, I found myself back in the CNN studio. I was back on air with, in a panel with other people, and everyone's saying, well, no, it's just an absolute coincidence. Well, we should talk about what happened, I guess.
Yeah, okay, so this one's actually a little bit less of a mystery, at least as I see it, right? So, I mean, at first
the element of mystery is less obvious.
Right, okay, so let's see. This was like the sister plane of MH370, which I didn't even know there was a such thing. But what they had, Malaysia Airlines had 15 777s out of the 18,000 in the world.
There are 18,000 like registered commercial aircraft that are that can carry passengers around. Not all of them are like active at all times, but if you think about, there's 15 planes that are Malaysian Airlines 777s, and there's tens of thousands of planes in general. Like, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. Yeah, so the odds that something is going to go wrong, and also there's never been a fatal accident with a 777.
Right. So this plane flew from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, or at least it was on the way.
Right.
And then it exploded midair. And the first reports were that it was shot down by a surface-to-air missile while flying over territory held by Russian-backed rebels. And that sounded okay.
They were called Russian-backed rebels.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
It was actually an operation by the Russian military. And they had made various attempts to make it seem like it wasn't what it was. They didn't want it to seem like Russia had just invaded Ukraine.
I mean, I remember they debadged these guys, right? They didn't have Russian emblems. They were just wearing
Yeah, Crimea had been taken over by these quote-unquote little green men.
Right.
That just sort of showed up, and they're like, we're here, we're taking it over. And the Ukrainians were so shocked that they didn't really know what to do, and they just let it happen, and that annoyed them later. But
it turned out it was in fact shot down by a surface-to-air missile. It was a 150-pound shrapnel-laced warhead. It tore open the airframe. I mean, these poor passengers, crew. Igor Gherkin, who was a GRU colonel, according to Reuters, he was in the active reserve. And he starts gloating all over social media that the rebels had destroyed a Ukrainian military transport plane.
Right.
But no, it was definitely not a military transport plane. He takes down his post. What happened next?
in case people don't know, GRU is a slightly inaccurate acronym because it's not really
Okay.
what they call it anymore. But it's what people use to. It's kind of like the modern KGB, except it's a
Right.
military intelligence. So it's like a sort of military version of the KGB.
It's a lot of
There-
former
there's-
KGB guys, for sure.
Yeah, it's like all of these sort of spycraft traditions carry. And Putin himself is former KGB.
Yes,
So the
he
Russian
was, yeah.
government is very kind of pro espionage, pro dirty tricks. This is how they. So it's no accident they didn't just invade Ukraine. They used all these sneaky subterfuges. So Igor Girkin is supposedly this volunteer who wanted to help out, his brethren in Ukraine by seceding from the Ukrainian government. And which I guess we could probably talk a lot about that in another episode too.
Yeah.
But so he is not just a guy in military fatigues who happens to be helping to run a resistance organization. He's actually a military officer in the Russian army / military intelligence specifically. So when he says something, you have to take it with a grain of salt. But so
yeah,
yes,
and he's maybe speaking on behalf of people higher up in
yeah,
the Russian
he's not
government.
freelancing.
Right.
Although
right.
Gherkin does turn out to be a rather colorful character and is now in prison in Russia right now for letting his little mouth run off a little bit.
There are an awful lot of people who are in prison in Russia because they ran their mouth off.
Well, they're lucky that they're in prison because the alternative is to get thrown out of a 7-story
window. Yeah, the Russian window cancer. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
So he
So
says,
he
that
says
the rebels shot it down by accident, and people like the Western analysts are like, yeah, that sounds good.
everyone believes it.
But not everybody.
Well, I'm definitely a little bit suspicious. I'm like, this is a little bit too convenient. I mean, I drew up I came up with an analogy that I quite liked, which is,
Okay.
imagine that you're a chicken farmer and you've never lost a chicken. You've got a nice fence and your chickens are very safe and you get lots of eggs. And then one day you find a dead chicken. It's dead. It's been killed by probably some creature. And you have no idea what creature because you just can't imagine. And then 4.5 months later or whatever, you find a fox stealing a chicken. You know what happened to the second chicken for sure, but you probably have pretty deep suspicions about the first one as well. The idea is just that, like, who's in the business of destroying Malaysian Airlines 777s through nefarious means in the first half or first part of 2014, right? There's at least one. I mean, imagine there's somebody. I mean, are there two perpetrators out there who, for some reason, taken a particular, hankering for the
I mean,
destruction?
you
of
wouldn't
this
think
particular
so.
plane?
Malaysia doesn't have any enemies. I mean, that I know of.
Yeah.
It's certainly not
Yeah.
anyone who has the capability to be shooting planes down or stealing
Yeah.
them and taking them to Russia, unless it is Russia. So Bellingcat comes in. These guys sound interesting to me. They're like open source intelligence people.
Yeah, they are. Elliot Higgins is this English guy who was unemployed shortly prior to this, and he'd been kind of sitting around in his underwear, literally on his couch at home, bored, and he had started to look at social media images of the war in Syria and wound up putting together a really compelling case that the Syrian government had been using chemical warfare against its own people. And this was kind of a big deal because President Obama had said if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons against its own people, this is a red line and the United States will do something.
But Bellingcat is, it's not like just a bunch of amateurs. I mean, this is filled with actual intelligence people who are kind of working on, without an official affiliation. Is that how you would describe it?
Well, Bellingcat kind of, I don't know if they single-handedly developed the concept of open source intelligence, but they certainly were. Elliot Higgins and then the people that kind of accumulated around him became like the founding fathers of this movement, and they still are very active in it. And so these guys, when MH17 was shot down, they took it upon themselves to start pouring through social media that had been put on people. Like a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine have cameras in their cars, and they'll post it.
Well, they
and so
love the
when
dash cams.
Dash cams, thank you, that's the word. And so they would be somebody would be driving down the road, and they would pass a tank or an armored vehicle, and they would post it on social media, and these guys would collect it, and they were able to put together the movements of this particular, it was called a Buk missile launcher.
This one. Bellingcat figures out that this is the 2nd Battalion of the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, which left its base outside of Kursk in Russia, drives south to the village
Milarivo or something. It kind of followed a roundabout. It like gone to it had gone to like Donetsk and then spent the night, and then it was delivered on a truck, and they were able to identify the particular truck, and then it was delivered to this field, and it sat in this field for several hours, just sitting there as plane after plane after plane went overhead. And then it shot down MH17. And now this particular vehicle was what's called a TELAR. And it's a transporter erector launcher. But one of the things that people noticed quite early was, well, it's not accompanied by like the radar truck that would like give it the detailed knowledge of exactly who was overhead. And so this kind of fit into the idea that, well, no, the people that were in this vehicle fired the rocket without knowing what they were shooting at.
Yeah.
And so the cover story is, well, we thought there was like a Ukrainian transport plane or something. We thought it was that. And there's a certain plausibility to this, because after Russia, took over parts of the Donbass, eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainians had fought back, and they had used like attack aircraft to really punish and hurt and kill a lot of the Russians that were fighting against them. And so the war was going very badly for the Russians, and they really wanted to stop these aerial assaults by the Ukrainians. And once they brought in these heavy guns like this Buk missile launcher, it really made the air very dangerous. And so it did have the effect of stopping the assault. And the war, it was kind of a turning point in the war where it became much more difficult, and Ukraine wasn't really able to gain much more ground after that for many, many years, until then the later invasion that happened.
So you'll have to pardon my ignorance here on SAM technology here, but because they didn't have the radar truck, would they have known that this was MH17? Or how could they have known that it was MH17?
This, again, is one of these assumptions that people make that don't really know the details, but it sounds reasonable. And kind of like in the last episode where like a lot of people thought, well, it had to fly over all these countries. It would have definitely been seen. Well, no, actually it doesn't work like that. And this is a very related topic, which is when you're talking about air defense systems, it's not like you have a missile launcher and then a radar next to it.
Okay.
Modern air defense systems are like a network of sensors and a network of launchers and other assets, and it's all kind of tied together. And so you don't have to be next to a radar. There's a bunch of radars all over the place, and you are tied into the
network.
The network, and the network is run by high-ranking officers. This is a missile system that can shoot down planes up to like 70,000 feet, and it goes for many miles. So it's a very dangerous weapon. And one of the first things that people are taught when they are in training to operate one of these things is you don't shoot it unless your officer, your superior, tells you to shoot it. So there's like 2 lieutenants in charge of this thing, and then they can't fire it until their bosses tell it, and their boss has to tell them. So there's what's called chain of command responsibility.
Right.
You can't fire this missile until you're told to do it. So the idea that these were militiamen who were just kind of freelancing and sort of taking wild potshots at things in the sky is not true. This was a vehicle belonging to a regular Russian military unit. It was under orders from the GRU, military intelligence, and there's no reason to think that it was operating outside of the context of the air defense network.
Yeah, furthermore, I mean, this was not a fighter plane. I mean, this was a slow-moving civilian aircraft that was on a flight path. So
that was on a flight path that was transmitting a transponder code that identified it very clearly. So it wasn't moving at the speed of military transport. It wasn't at the altitude of a military transport. And what's more, it was on a flight path that this rocket launcher had been sitting under for hours, watching civilian airliner after civilian airliner go overhead. There was absolutely no reason why these people in this launcher would think that it was a military transport, and there's no reason why they would take a pot shot at it anyway.
Yeah, so this is the part that I think is totally bananas. And in fact, it's so bananas I asked you, like, is this like verified? The headline here from Business Insider is Obama spoke to Putin right after the Malaysia passenger plane crash in Ukraine. Right. So this is a real conversation that happened. And basically, if I'm getting this correctly, on a pre-planned call between Putin and Obama at the Kremlin's request, Putin
requested the day before the shoot down of this plane, he was the guy who told President Obama that the plane was shot down. Yeah. That's how the West first found out about MH370 getting shot down. Putin personally told Obama on a pre-scheduled call right after the thing happened. And so I've spent years trying to work out the exact timing of the start of the call and when was it that air traffic control, like what minute did they figure out what had happened? Because the investigators, so just to jump ahead a little bit, this wound up being a criminal case in the Netherlands where they investigated what happened, and they sort of built on Bellingcat's open source intelligence and also added in like interviews with people and so forth. So they got a really granular understanding of what happened in this crash, and they have transcripts of what the air traffic controllers were saying to one another, but it only goes for like the first half hour, and so I don't know what happens after that. But I've always thought that if the call between Putin and Obama started before air traffic control themselves figured out what had happened, that would be pretty compelling evidence that it was pre-planned, because Putin knew that the plane was shot down before air traffic control knew that it was shot down.
There are readouts of this call, right? So the White House said, quote, during the call, President Putin noted the early reports of a downed passenger jet near the Russia-Ukraine border. Right. And the Kremlin corroborated this. Their quote was, the Russian leader informed the U.S. president of the report from air traffic controllers that the Malaysian plane had crashed on Ukrainian territory, which had arrived immediately before the phone call.
Right.
And, oh, by the way, 23 U.S. citizens were among the people who died on this plane.
Yeah, and so if Russia deliberately shot down this plane, Obama would have known about it instantly, because he knew what time the call started, and he knew how long it took them to figure out what was going on. And so I've always been extremely curious as to when that call started. I even went to, so this was part of the White House, and the White House is not subject to FOIA
right.
requests. So I was thwarted in that. I actually went to a lecture that was given in Manhattan, and the presenter had worked in this department of the White House, and so I went up to her afterwards. She was like signing her books and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Can you? This is this piece of information that I want to know. Can you tell me?" And she's like, "I can't tell you, and it's not public information, and you're out of luck."
Right. So as I understand it, the only thing that you get out of these kind of high-level meetings are the readouts of what the White House and the Kremlin.
As you would know, because you worked in the White House.
Yeah, I didn't have that kind of access, but yeah, you don't get a transcript. It's not like, it's kind of like their version of it. Okay. Which, if they match, I mean, that's cool. And in this case, they do match, but we don't have evidence that, Obama said, you must be freaking kidding me, Vlad.
So my understanding is that part of the reason is they don't like to make it public is because, like, if they had a 2-minute phone call or on an important topic, it would look bad. But what does happen is that, like, 20 years later, sometimes you'll see in the news, like, oh, like phone records from like late Reagan administration just got released.
I mean, they're
So-
held on to, that's for sure. I mean, except for that one where Trump and Putin met, and Trump ordered, I think in Copenhagen, and Trump ordered them to tear up. I think he might have eaten them, as he was wont to do. But
This is part. This will be. We'll get to that too.
We'll get to that, but I mean,
yeah.
these records are kept. They're just not something that we can see.
And they will come out someday. It will come out someday. Everyone assumed, everybody, and I interviewed all of these foreign policy experts and all these old hands who were like knew all about Russia and Ukraine, and I said to them, is there any possibility that this was like actually not an accident?
Yeah.
And everyone's like, no, there's no way that Russia would do this. No. It was definitely. I mean, look at what Igor Girkin said. It had to be. It was a big embarrassment for them. They didn't plan it. And there's a sort of a words of wisdom. If you want to lie to somebody, like the most impenetrable lie is a lie that's like embarrassing for you, right? So. It's very believable that you did something bad if that bad thing is embarrassing to you, right?
Girkin and some other high-ranking Russian officials were convicted in absentia in a Dutch court.
Right. So Girkin, who said it was all a mistake, he's now been sentenced to life in prison in the Netherlands, which is probably like a summer camp.
At this point, it's pretty much universally accepted and understood that Russia did this. They've kind of dropped the facade that this was like an accident, right? Like the world believes.
Russia did it. Russian military intelligence organized it. People have been criminally found guilty for their role in it. And yet, there's one big but.
Okay.
The most people who have an opinion about MH17 still think that it was a mistake, that they didn't intend to shoot it down, because why would they? And but this is the thing that I keep getting back to, is like, if you know how these air defense networks work, there would be no excuse for them to not know exactly what this plane was.
Well, this brings up kind of a point that everyone I know who's watched our podcast is like, everything you're saying is really convincing, but why?
But why?
And
why?
We can spend hours on that one, but the short version is you don't always know why in asymmetrical warfare. You don't know why the bad guy did something. They may have their own reasons. They may just be testing something out. They may be saving it for later. I mean, we're not privy to that information. But just because we don't know the why doesn't mean we can't figure out the what.
So you just used a word that we haven't used before, but that is important: asymmetrical warfare, also known as hybrid warfare, and it is this kind of an ancient idea that war isn't just about hitting your enemy with your sword or your arrow. It's also about deceiving your enemy, discouraging your enemy, making your enemy think that you're more powerful than you really are, or less powerful than you really are. And this has a long tradition in military history. It has a very particular long history in Russian military history. But we've already talked about how Putin was using deception to create a false narrative around this war that he had started. And so he was trying to achieve his objectives, not just through strength, but also through cleverness and deception. So one of the hallmarks of hybrid warfare is that you don't always know what your enemy is up to. You don't understand what his goals are. You don't understand what his MO is, what his means and his methods are. So confusion is often an aim in itself. You want your opponent to be confused. And the fact that we are baffled by MH370, the fact that we continue to be baffled by MH17, even though it looks like a very blunt, kind of brutal thing, is all part and parcel with something we're going to see more of. So we're going to see more confusion, more nefarious skullduggery. We have now entered into kind of a new period of history, one in which clever bad actors are causing chaos for reasons that aren't always clear.
Because so the short version of what you just said is when people say why, I say, well, why does Putin throw people out of windows? Why does he poison them with polonium tea? There are easier ways to make bad guys or to make your enemies go away, but that's just how this guy rolls, and that's how the former KGB rolls, because they insert confusion and fear. So anyone who would look at MH370 and say, why would Putin do that? To me, the question is, why wouldn't he do it?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like we've gone long on this one, so let me, I just want to say one more thing on this topic, which is that one of the hallmarks of hybrid warfare is confusion, but more specifically, kind of burying the narrative in all kinds of alternative, ridiculous narratives. And so when MH17 was shot down, you had all these stories circulating that the Americans really did it, that the Ukrainians really did it, that MH17 was actually MH370, and that all the bodies that they collected had been frozen.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it kind of cast in a different light all of the crazy stories that were being circulated about MH370. There was actually, I remember, a Ukrainian-linked company at the time that was saying, oh, we have pictures of it in Australia or something. And there were, I mean, to this day, I mean, every documentary, except for, I thought, the Netflix documentary, every documentary for years and years was like, oh, there's 12 different theories, and they're all conspiracy theories, and like nothing. There's a great book by a guy named Peter Pomerantsev, who was in media in Russia, is also educated in the West. And the name of the book is Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And this is the kind of mindset that an autocracy puts its people into, where there's all these crazy rumors. You can't believe anything that anybody says. And you can also believe any wild rumor because it's just, the ground underneath your feet has turned to mush.
So maybe we should have called this episode #gaslighting, but maybe that'll be the next one.